We go now to Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York. Good morning and welcome to the show.
Good morning, Margaret. Thanks for having me.
Sure. You are in a competitive race in your Hudson Valley area. We know 2 years ago, Republicans flipped 4 seats in the state of New York, and former Speaker Nancy Pelosi said it was New York that cost Democrats the majority. Your seat was one of them. So, given all of the infighting within the Republican Party right now, what is your affirmative argument to your voters potentially here that Republicans should retain control?
Well, look, we're in a deeply divided government. Obviously, Democrats control the Senate and the White House right now. Republicans control the House. Regardless of the outcome in November, we're still going to have very tight margins, whether it's in the House or the Senate. And I've proven myself to be a bipartisan legislator. I've been rated the 4th most bipartisan member of Congress. I've passed 10 bills, 5 of which have been signed into law by President Biden. The voters in my district understand that I will work tirelessly to get things done on their behalf, working with Republicans and Democrats. And in this Congress, you know, in the House, we've actually gotten a lot done. We reined in federal spending, saving taxpayers $2.1 trillion over the next decade, capping federal spending at 1%. The reckless spending we saw in the first 2 years of the Biden administration is why we dealt with record inflation, why grocery prices, energy prices, housing costs have gone up astronomically. In my district, Margaret, the average mortgage cost is up $1,000 a month over the last year because of high interest rates trying to contain inflation. This has been a challenge for folks. And when I'm out in the district, what folks are most concerned about is the affordability crisis, the crisis at our southern border, and the international crises around the globe.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of contributing factors to inflation. Fiscal spending, certainly potentially one of them. But I want to follow up on something you just said, because you are perceived, certainly here in Washington, as a moderate Republican who is willing to reach across the aisle. In a Fox town hall this past week, Donald Trump said the enemy inside the United States is more dangerous than China, Russia, and other countries. Take a listen.
It is the enemy from within, and they're very dangerous. They're Marxists and communists and fascists, and they're sick. I use a guy like Adam Schiff because they made up the Russia hoax. We have China, we have Russia, we have all these countries. If you have a smart president, they can all be handled. The more difficult are, you know, the Pelosi's, these people, they're so sick and they're so evil.
The leader of your party and potentially the next president of the United States says that Democrats are more dangerous than nuclear Russia, than China. If you're reelected, how is it possible that you would be able to reach across the aisle and work with Democrats?
Well, I've done it. You know, I've been praised by President Biden as somebody who he can work with, somebody who can reach across the aisle and address the challenges that we're facing as a country.
But in a Trump
I am a member of the
administration.
problem solvers. Some of my closest colleagues in Washington have been Josh Gottheimer, Richie Torres, Jared Moskowitz. Look, at the end of the day, the American people are going to decide in 16 days who the next president is going to be and who controls Congress. I have proven in this Congress, in a divided government, that I can work across the aisle to get things done. And I will say this, when you look around at the challenges facing the United States, the greatest threat is the unholy alliance between China, Russia, and Iran, and the work they are doing to undermine and destabilize the United States, Israel, Europe, and the free world. That is the threat that I have been focused on in Congress. It's why I passed the Special Envoy for the Abraham Accords Act, why I passed the SHIP Act and the Iran-China Energy Sanctions Act to take on that illicit oil trade between China and Iran that is funding terrorism, that is funding Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and other terrorist networks in the region, and why Israel is under constant threat.
Well, but you would then, I assume in your answer, be disputing the idea that Democrats are so sick and so evil that they're worse than Russia and China. That seems to be what you're saying. But look, doesn't rhetoric like that feed into the divisions that our adversaries are exploiting?
Well, there's no question that our adversaries exploit our divisions. When Democrats say that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, that Republicans are part of a fascist movement, that undermines us as well. All of the rhetoric needs to stop. We need to focus on the threats that are actually facing the United States, which are from China, Russia, and Iran, the crisis at our southern border, in which drug cartels are trafficking women, children, drugs, fentanyl pouring into our country. These are the challenges we need to focus on as an American people and as government officials, and that's my commitment, regardless of the outcome of this election in November.
Before I let you go, you have worked on a bill to try to prevent rogue states from taking Americans hostage. We'll hear shortly from Paul Whelan, a freed American hostage. How do you stop countries from doing this?
Look, we need to be very firm and resolute. Obviously, Russia has engaged in this for years. You see 7 Americans still being held hostage by Hamas in this conflict currently. Iran over the years has taken Americans hostage. We need to implement sanctions on these regimes, and we need to get our allies to recognize these are not folks we can work with. And so we've introduced legislation to combat it directly.
And we'll hear from Paul Whelan up next. We'll be right back. Freed hostage American Paul Whelan came back home this August after a 5.5-year imprisonment on trumped-up espionage charges. In his first interview since becoming a free man and returning from Russia, Whelan shared with us his experience.
The Russian government wanted to put pressure on the United States by treating me badly. Sleep deprivation is considered torture. What the Russians did in Lefortovo prison, it's the FSB prison in Moscow, they kept a light on 24 hours in my cell. So sleeping was very difficult. At the labor camp for 4 years, they would come every 2 hours to my bed at night, and they would wake me up. They'd shine a light in my face and take a picture. Every night, every 2 hours, I was woken up. Getting off that sleep pattern has been very, very difficult.
You were in Moscow in 2018, as I understand it, for a friend's wedding. And Russia, I guess, has now released a video of your arrest showing an acquaintance who worked for the FSB putting a flash drive into your hand in a Moscow bathroom. Moments later, you are arrested. Who was that man? I think his name's Ilya Yatsenko. Who was he, and did he set you up?
Well, those are issues that I'm not really prepared to speak about right now. I am going to write a book, and that's a situation I'll explain in the book.
Do you think, though, that you were targeted, that you were being set up?
Well, I was certainly targeted. I hadn't done anything. I hadn't committed espionage. I was accused of being a brigadier general with the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA. I certainly, was never a general, and I never worked for the DIA, and I was never a secret agent. So the case they came up with was, materially false. I was obviously set up.
At the time, you were a global head of security for an auto parts firm.
Right.
You have a background in the Marines. You have a background as a police officer. And you had begun corresponding with Russians. You traveled to Russia on a fairly frequent basis. Did it ever enter your mind that there was reason to suspect that you were a spy?
Well, since an early age, I've been traveling the world. I'd taken my parents to Russia to see Moscow. It was safe for tourists. The problem, though, is, you can never tell what a rogue regime is going to do. And that's what the Russians are. And they came after me. They said I was a spy, and then obviously they held me as a hostage. And that's an important part to bring up, is that I was a hostage. And from day one, the Russians told me that they were holding me to do a trade with the United States.
Because they know that the American government will fight to get American citizens back.
Right. Yeah. Who wants to leave a tourist in prison for no reason?
Were you working in any way for any government? I know you have citizenship in Canada, the US, Ireland, the UK.
Well, those are issues that I'll discuss in the book. It's nothing that I want to get into now.
But you do think you were targeted by the FSB, which is part of Russian intelligence.
The FSB does run Russia. Yeah, we have to be clear about that. So when the FSB picked me up, they weren't just a couple beat cops that saw an American and thought they'd grab somebody. This sort of thing comes down from Putin.
So when you were taken, about a year into your detention, your employer, Borg Warner, they restructured and they laid you off.
Right.
That must have hit you really hard as you were sitting in Russia in detention. How did you deal with that?
If you can call an act by an employer un-American, that was un-American. What really bothered me wasn't so much losing my job, but that Borg Warner continued to do business in Russia while I was being held prisoner there. They refused to cooperate with the US government. They refused to cooperate with people that were trying to help me.
It's just a contrast with other Americans who were detained. The Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gerskovich, the WNBA star Brittany Griner. They had advocacy behind them. Did you feel that you were just there alone?
Left out to dry? Yeah, Borg Warner left me out to dry. Yeah, Borg Warner left me out to dry.
So in 2020, you're sentenced to 16 years in a Russian labor camp. And then in 2022, the world changes dramatically. Not only is WNBA star Brittany Griner taken in mid-February of that year, Vladimir Putin shocks the world by invading Ukraine. How much of this were you hearing in terms of what was happening outside the prison?
I was fortunate. The ambassadors and the consular teams from my 4 countries, America, Canada, Ireland, and England, would come and visit me on a regular basis at the labor camp. I received a lot of information from them. I did get mail from home. The Russian media is just propaganda, and they didn't report much on the war because they were losing, and that was interesting for us. Information came in very, very slowly, but when the Russian government started taking prisoners from our camps to go to the war, then we knew they were really in trouble.
That's when mercenaries, the Wagner group, this Russian group, was going to the prisons and telling convicts, you can get out if you come fight in Ukraine.
Right.
Did you lose people you knew to that fight?
Yeah, from my camp, 450 went.
Wow.
I knew all of them. Some of them are dead. Some have arms and legs missing. They've all got some sort of PTSD. They went through a traumatic experience. They were used on the front lines to walk through minefields. They were used as cannon fodder. They would be sent out in front of patrols to try to draw the enemy fire. I mean, that's what Russia's doing with these people, and they're all young. Putin has thrown away a generation of his youth in the Ukraine for nothing.
Are you in contact with some of those convicts who went on the battlefield?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what they're sharing with you?
The prisoners from the camp that went to the front line, they had communication, and they would communicate with us. And the communication from them, I was passing back to the 4 governments. And
How?
Through illegal cell phones.
You got a cell phone into the Russian labor camp?
Yeah, we had burner phones.
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And the guards didn't know about it, or they just looked the other way?
They looked the other way. A Russian prison guard gets $300-400 a month. You give them a carton of cigarettes, and you can do just about anything you want.
Trevor Reed, he was freed in exchange for a Russian drug dealer. American diplomats told us Trevor Reed got out because the U.S. feared he was going to die in prison. But you were left behind.
Right.
That had to hurt.
Devastating. Devastating. I was told a deal was in the works. I was told that I would be home soon. Trevor and I would be getting on a plane, flying out of Russia. Together. Unfortunately, I was sitting in the factory working, and on the radio, the Russian radio, I heard that a deal had been made and a trade had taken place for Trevor to go home. All I could do was just sit back and try to process what I had just heard in Russian, and all I could do is just keep on working. And then later I got to a phone and I was able to call Roger Karstens, and I asked him some pretty direct questions.
He's the hostage envoy.
Yeah, I asked him some pretty direct questions.
What did you say?
Basically, WTF. Yeah, why am I here? I was glad that Trevor went home. That's not a problem. I was glad that Trevor went home, especially because he was suffering some medical conditions. He had some issues. And I said, okay, that's fine, but what about me? I'm still here. What are you going to do? I asked to speak to Secretary Blinken, and of course, he and I had several long-winded phone calls from prison.
Between the State Department and the prison?
Yeah.
You're speaking to the Secretary of State?
Yeah.
Did he apologize?
He explained, and he let me know that the United States was coming for me. They were doing everything they could, that the Russians kept changing the goalposts. He's a good man, and I've met with him personally since my release. I think that he and his team were doing everything that they could at their level to get me home. Whether other people at higher levels really were, I don't know.
So that's April. And then months later.
Right. I'm still there.
You're still there. And Brittany Griner, a WNBA star who'd been picked up on, drug charges, was freed in exchange for Victor Boot,
right,
the merchant of death. Your twin brother David said it was a public disappointment, but he feared it would be a catastrophe for you. Your family was really worried about your well-being.
Well, I was too. I was too.
Was that your lowest point?
That was. And, I started to explain earlier that I'd been working in the factory. I was called to the warden's office. The FSB's there, et cetera, et cetera. There's a phone call for me. I pick up the phone. It's the White House. It's one of the officers with the DHS. And he basically tells me that Brittany Griner was going home, that the trade was for Victor Boot. And I asked him point blank, I said, so what else do you have to trade? And he said, nothing. I said, you gave up your negotiation platform. There's nothing else. How do you now get me back? And he said, well, we're going to reconvene tomorrow to discuss that.
Oof.
And I said point blank to him, you realize what you've done, that you've abandoned me here. You have no one to trade. They don't want anyone else. And he said, yes, we realize that. And I said, well, say hello to Brittany. I'm glad she's going home. She shouldn't have been there at all, ever.
But the U.S. government did continue to try. And in fact, the Russians started testing out that assassin who had shot dead someone in the middle of Berlin. That was Vadim Krasikov.
Yeah, as soon as he was arrested, they said, we'll trade him for Paul.
And this was extremely difficult. President Biden had to convince the German chancellor to free a convicted assassin who shot someone dead in the light of day in the middle of Berlin.
Right.
But ultimately, the German government agreed to do that. What did you think of that trade?
I'm glad the president did what he did to get Evan and I home. There were a few others. Alsu, she came home. Some of Navalny's people were released. When you're the president, you have to make tough decisions. But the U.S. policy has to be one of deterrence. They've got to do something.
When you did make it out in this hostage swap, you landed here in the United States, and it was President Biden and Vice President Harris who met you on the tarmac.
I didn't realize the president and the vice president were going to be there. I had been in solitary confinement for the 5 days prior to leaving at Lefordova prison in Moscow. I had on clothes that I had worn in 2018 when I'd been arrested. They hadn't been washed. They were too big for me. I was very careful coming down the stairs from the plane. And so I came down slowly. I waved at people that were waving at me, and then I gave the president a salute as the commander-in-chief. And I just walked down to him and started talking to him. I thanked him for getting us home. President Biden, he was very, very personable. The same with Vice President Harris. You saw us. We embraced, we hugged, we chatted. At one point, the president took the flag lapel pin off his lapel and put it on my shirt. We kind of milled about chatting and talking to the media and whatnot. And, that made it real because we were with real people. We talked, we chatted. There was a funny picture, I think I've sent it to your team. In the operations building, there was a TV on. And I'm standing by the TV watching, and somebody said, oh, it's just the Olympics. I was like, really? Because I hadn't seen the Olympics. And it was women's basketball. And as I'm looking, I said, hey, look, it's Brittany. Brittany's on TV.
Brittany Griner.
Yeah. But it was one of those incredible moments where you're finally connecting things. Yeah. And
it's surreal.
It is. But Brittany was a great help. After she came home, I think probably within days of her getting home, she was talking to people about how they could support me. And she had people making monetary donations, sending cards, sending letters, offering all sorts of support. Her basketball team, all sorts of support.
You said it didn't feel real until you were flying over England. What was it that you saw that hit home for you?
So we'd gone to Turkey, and now we're flying back across Europe. And we're in a small plane, CIA plane, and I knew we were getting close to England. As we got closer, I saw the White Cliffs of Dover. So, there was absolutely no question. I mean, they are so white; they're whiter than the White House.
You had to have thought of your parents too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and my family members, in England and Ireland, and actually in France and Poland also, they were monitoring what was happening. They knew what was happening. And I thought about them, knowing that I'd be flying over their homes on my way back. So yeah, it's still emotional to this day. It's not every day that you're held hostage. It's not every day that you're released. So there's a lot. You talk about PTSD. There's a lot of that comes back in a positive manner. And that was one of those moments where. I wasn't expecting to see the White Cliffs of Dover, but I did. And during the war, they guided the Spitfire pilots back. And for me, it was guiding me and Evan and Alsu back to the United States. So, yeah, it's still one of those things that I think about. It's emotional, and I'm sure it always will be. But, that's one of the good memories.
That's it for us today. Thank you all for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.